Hello, for this lesson we're talking about circumferences and areas of circles. So, first of all, we need to understand what is a circumference. A circumference is simply the distance around a circle. So, thinking of usual shapes that we're working with, we usually call that the perimeter, right? We talk about perimeters of triangles, of rectangles, of different polygons. But when we're talking about circles, the distance around the circle is not the perimeter, we call it the circumference. Okay? And then area is just like any other area we're talking about. It's talking about the square units that shape covers. Okay? We need to understand the formulas for these things, because just like areas or anything that we're working with in this chapter, if you know the formulas, it's easy. Okay? So, something else important to know. We have two variables that we will often see. One is D. D stands for diameter. A diameter, it extends all the way across a circle and it goes through the midpoint of your circle, or the center of your circle. Okay? So, in example one here where we're talking about circumferences, that's the diameter. It goes through the center of the circle and it goes all the way from one side of the circle to the other. That's the D. The R represents the radius. Okay, the radius, it extends from the center of the circle to the edge, but it doesn't go from one edge to the other edge of the circle. Okay, it's just from the center to the edge. That's the radius. Now, the diameter is twice the length of the radius, right? Because it's really just two radii put together. Okay, so the diameter is twice the radius, or the radius is half the diameter. Okay. Another thing, you're going to see a symbol. It's not a variable, but it is the pi symbol. The pi symbol, a lot of times will be said it's roughly, or similar to, it's 3.14. Right? If you use the pi symbol in a calculator, it's going to put in a long, non-terminating decimal. Okay, it's going to put in a long, non-terminating number. They've never found the end of pi, never will. Okay? So, here's how we use these formulas. Okay? We have for circumference, C equals D times pi, or C equals 2 pi r. And that's because, remember, the radius is half of a diameter. So you have to multiply the radius by 2 in order to get it to the diameter. So that's why you can use either of these formulas. So if you're given the radius, you can use that formula. If you're given the diameter, you can use that formula. For area, you're using A equals pi r squared. Okay, you have to have the radius. That means if you're given the diameter, you need to cut it in two, right? And then you need to square it. Remember, order of operations. Pi r squared. That means that the r needs to be squared. The radius needs to be squared before you multiply. You can't do 3.14 times whatever r is and then square it. That's going to get you the wrong answer. Okay? So let's try this. Instructions say find the circumference and area of each circle. Okay, so let's work on the circumference for number 1. Okay. What formula do I want to use? I want to use this formula because I'm given the radius. It only goes from the center to the edge. So I want to use C equals 2 pi r. Okay? So I could plug in C equals 2 pi times 5, and I could use commutative property, say, well, I can rearrange this multiplication problem and do 2 times 5. I could get 10. Okay, and that would get me that maybe some teachers will ask you to leave it as that. Okay, to have you just put in 10 pi. Some will have you multiply it out. If we have to multiply it out, it's going to be 31.4, and then what's it in yards. And something to note is that when we find circumference, it's a distance around a circle. Right? We're not finding an area, so we just leave it as yards. Okay, so that's our answer there. 31.4 yards is the circumference of that circle. Okay? For number 2, well, number 1, but part 2 of it, I'm looking for the area. And I have to use this formula, pi r squared, right? For there, the radius is 5. So I go A equals pi, and then 5 squared, right? A is going to equal pi times 25, because 5 squared is 25. And then if we're multiplying that out, 3.14 times by 25. It's going to get us 78.5 yards. And this time, since we're talking about area, it is going to be yards squared. Moving on to this shape, this one we are given the diameter. So when I do C equals, I'm going to do D times pi, because I know the diameter. I don't need to do 2 pi r because I'm not given the radius. So C equals, if my diameter is 6 pi, right? Some teachers, you may just leave it as 6 pi feet. Okay, but we're going to multiply that out. 6 times 3.14 is 18.84, and this one is in feet. Now you ask yourself, do I need to do feet squared? The answer is no, because the circumference is just a distance. It is the distance around the circle. So I leave it as feet. For the second part, I need to find the area. Area equals pi r squared. Okay? Well, this time I'm given the diameter. So, do I just plug in the 6? I do not, because that's an r. I need a radius. Remember, a radius is half of a diameter. So, what's half of 6? It's 3. So, my r is 3 for this problem. Okay? So, a equals pi 3 squared. A equals pi times 9. Okay? And then we just multiply that. So, 9 times 3.14. If I can plug in the correct numbers to my calculator, then you should get 28.26 feet. And this one I have to put squared because it's talking about the area. Okay? So, some other things to remember is if you're plugging in on a calculator and you're using the actual pi button, it's going to enter a non-terminating decimal. Okay? And what that means is that your answer will extend far beyond the hundredths or the tenths place, like in my examples. Okay? So make sure you're checking the instructions. Where do the instructions tell you to round to when you finish? Okay? Good luck with your problems on circumferences and area of circles. I hope that this video helped.